In the summer of 2009, 5 members of a rising indie rock band vanished while recording at an isolated mountain retreat in North Carolina. For years, their disappearance was buried beneath rumors, silence, and official indifference, written off as a tragic accident, a misadventure, or simply another lost chapter in music history. But more than a decade later, when a desperate brother returned to the place where it all ended, the truth began to crack through the surface. What he uncovered wasn't just a mystery, it was a cover-up, a system designed to silence voices that refused to conform. This is the haunting, defiant, and unforgettable story of Velvet Voltage, the band that disappeared, and the movement their music left behind. Under the pale orange haze of a fading summer sky in August 2009, the last known footage of the band, Velvet Voltage, flickered grainily on a handheld camcorder resting atop a cracked studio speaker, recording more than just music. It was capturing history, although no one knew it then. The studio, perched precariously near the edge of Black Rock Mountain in western North Carolina, was a skeletal retreat carved from silence, isolation, and moss-covered pine. It had once been a ranger station, retrofitted into a music incubator by a little-known real estate group offering creative refuge to aspiring artists. For 5 hungry musicians in their early 20s, all fire and rebellion and guitars with chipped paint, it seemed like fate. There was Jalen Jace Fields, the de facto leader, songwriter, and soul of the band. Marlon and Ezra on bass and drums, inseparable twins who finished each other's sentences and solos. Olivia, their sharp-tongued lead guitarist who played like she was cutting through glass. And Mateo, the quiet keyboardist whose fingers seemed to channel ghosts. They had driven up from Atlanta in a rusted-out van with dreams of pressing vinyl, not vanishing from memory. The first few days were euphoric. The acoustics were raw but alive, and the elevation did something magical to their sound. Choruses that once felt flat now soared. They recorded late into the night, candle wax dripping onto lyric sheets, black coffee percolating beside distortion pedals. They filmed everything, laughing at the bad takes, reliving the moments when magic slipped from their mouths and fingertips. But beneath the music, something began to shift. Strange men in dark clothing, neither studio staff nor musicians, began appearing on the grounds, never speaking, just watching. Olivia was the first to comment, joking that the place felt like a cult compound masquerading as a recording lodge. The humor didn't land. Jace wrote an email to his older brother Darren, time-stamped 2:12 a.m., with a chilling sentence, "We don't feel safe here." That email would be the last anyone outside the band received. On the 4th day, studio staff reported that Velvet Voltage had packed their equipment and left early, citing creative differences and family emergencies. But no calls came. Phones were silent. Darren, in Chicago at the time, tried repeatedly to reach his brother. The number rang, then eventually stopped ringing altogether. Police reports were filed. A brief investigation occurred, brief because the land was privately owned, and the band had no known enemies. Studio staff were cooperative but vague. No vehicles were ever found. No gear, no remains. Only the dusty footprints in the gravel lot and a single Polaroid pinned to a corkboard in the staff break room. The 5 band members posing in front of a pine tree, smiling, unaware that they were already ghosts. As months became years, the case dissolved into one of those stories told in quiet regret, mostly by families and a handful of indie fans who still played the group's lone demo on loop like a prayer. Black Rock Studio was eventually closed. In 2016, the property was sold, renovated, and turned into a so-called cultural heritage retreat, a part of a larger development project funded by Mountain View Solutions, a land investment group that advertised eco-conscious innovation while swallowing acres of land faster than trees could fall. A decade after the band vanished, in the summer of 2019, Darren Fields found himself standing in the lobby of the new retreat during a public exhibit on lost voices of Appalachian music. It was quiet and sterile, all glass and concrete pretending to be wood and warmth. He moved through displays with detached eyes until one installation, titled "Echoes in the Pines," froze him cold. Behind a polished plexiglass frame hung a high-visibility vest. A small tag near the bottom read, "Recovered from Black Rock Studio during renovations. Belonged to local enforcement assisting musicians in 2009. Darren leaned closer. The vest had a name embroidered on the chest, R. Halverson. Darren stepped back, heart thudding. That name. Officer Rick Halverson. He remembered it from one of Jace's journal entries, something about a cop who kept showing up without ever being called. He had dismissed it at the time as paranoia, or maybe a misunderstood attempt at community outreach. But now, here it was, displayed like a trophy, disconnected from context, treated as heritage instead of potential evidence. He asked the exhibit curator where the vest came from, but she didn't know. It had arrived with the archival materials from the renovation team. That night, Darren went back to his hotel, unearthed an old external hard drive, and searched through the hundreds of video files Jace had backed up. Near the end, labeled simply Takes August 5th, he found a 6-minute clip of the group playing an acoustic version of a new song called The Last Exit. But something in the reflection of the studio's window made him pause. He replayed it, frame by frame. Behind the band, in the pine-shaded yard, stood 2 figures, one in a black jacket, the other wearing a high-vis vest, with a dark name patch glinting faintly in the moonlight. Darren stared at the screen. R. Halverson. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but he knew it was no longer just about music. He had always assumed his brother's disappearance was an unsolvable tragedy, a painful absence with no teeth to it. But this was a thread. And Darren had just started pulling dot. The drive up Black Rock Mountain was longer than Darren remembered, the roads narrower, the trees older, or perhaps it was simply his imagination weighing down everything with suspicion. He hadn't been back in 10 years, not since the week after the band had disappeared, and the local sheriff, quoting lack of evidence and jurisdictional confusion, had urged him gently but firmly to let it go. But now, as his tires crunched the familiar gravel curve leading toward the former studio, now a repurposed retreat center, the air felt heavier, loaded with ghosts that hadn't rested. The so-called cultural heritage retreat looked nothing like the old Ranger Station studio hybrid he remembered from photos and his own brief, desperate visit back then. Gone were the wooden beams and low-slung roof. In their place stood a modernist 2-story structure with vast panes of glass, a faux rustic porch with designer rockers, and a sign etched in cursive steel, the Black Rock Institute for Appalachian Arts and History. Darren parked near the back, away from the staff entrance. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He hadn't called ahead. He just needed to see the place, needed to stand where Jace had stood, breathe the air his brother might have breathed on those final days. He brought with him a copy of the video, the one with the faint reflection, and a still frame printed and folded into his pocket, a detail blown up, the letters R. Halverson visible, even under the distortion. He didn't expect answers today. He just needed to look. Inside, the building was even more sterile than the exhibit area had suggested. Stone tile floors, curated lighting, touchscreen displays. A bored receptionist barely looked up from her tablet. Darren wandered through the public zones until he reached a restricted hallway marked Staff-Only Maintenance and Archives. The door was ajar. No one seemed to notice. He slipped through. It didn't take long to find a basement access stairwell. The metal handrails were cold and slightly damp. This part of the building hadn't changed. As he descended, he could smell the faint mildew of foundation concrete and the forgotten wood of the old structure buried beneath the renovations. Downstairs, he moved past unused storage lockers and utility closets until he came upon a locked door labeled Mechanical Access, East Wing. He paused. This wing, according to the site map he had memorized online, was where the old studio control room had once been. Curious, he leaned against the door, ear pressed to the cold steel. Nothing. Then a faint clank. Then silence again. Footsteps maybe, or equipment. He turned back quickly and retraced his steps, determined not to be caught trespassing. Not yet. Not without more. As he reached the ground floor again, his phone vibrated. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Darren Fields?" a male voice asked, crisp, authoritative. "Yes. Who is this?" "Deputy Rick Halverson. I was told you were asking about me at the exhibit." Darren froze. His voice came out flat. "Who told you that?" "Let's meet, talk. There's a coffee shop in Boone, neutral ground, nothing formal." Darren hesitated. He hadn't expected Halverson to call him, hadn't even contacted the man yet. "All right, today?" "In an hour." Click. The line went dead. 1 hour later, Darren sat across from a man whose face he recognized from grainy newspaper clippings, local interviews, and Jace's old notes. Rick Halverson had aged, but not poorly. His silvering hair was neatly parted, his uniform gone in favor of a casual button-down and khakis, like a retired camp counselor. But his eyes, icy gray-blue, were guarded, watchful. "You're looking for your brother," he said, no small talk. Darren nodded. "You knew him?" Halverson tilted his head. "I met him, briefly. I visited the studio that summer, like I did with a lot of out-of-town acts. Make sure they weren't doing drugs, disturbing wildlife, the usual." "You left your vest there," Darren said, sliding the still frame across the table. "Or maybe you didn't mean to. Maybe it was used by someone else after you." Halverson studied the image for a long time. "You think I hurt them," he said quietly. "I think you know something. Something you never said." The former deputy leaned back. "Let me tell you what I do remember. There were tensions that week. Some guys came up from Asheville, developers, talked about buying out the studio. I heard rumors the band got into it with them, something about being pushed to write a song for a land commercial, a branding piece. Your brother refused. He said it was selling out. That kind of refusal," he paused, tapping the table, "could make things complicated for people with a lot of money at stake." "Were you on their payroll?" Darren asked. "No," Halverson said flatly, "but I didn't stop anything either, and I didn't dig." A long silence settled between them. Finally, Darren asked, "Why now? Why agree to meet me?" Halverson looked down at the printed photo again. "Because I've been waiting 10 years for someone else to see that vest." Darren leaned forward. "You're telling me they were silenced?" "I'm telling you," Halverson said quietly. "They never left that mountain." Once Darren drove back toward Black Rock, in a silence so thick it pressed against his ribs like gravity. Halverson's last words repeated in his head like a broken chorus. They never left that mountain. He replayed the conversation in his mind, analyzing every pause, every flicker of expression. The man hadn't confessed, not in any legal sense, but he'd given Darren more than any authority had in a decade. A lead, a direction, and a quiet acknowledgement that something terrible had been buried, perhaps literally. It was almost evening now. The mountain cast long shadows across the two-lane road, winding through pine and spruce. Darren pulled over at the turnout he remembered from years ago, once a trailhead, now blocked off by a crude chain and a private property sign bearing the logo of Mountain View Solutions. He stared at the sign, then at the dense tree line beyond it. Somewhere back there was the original foundation of the studio. Somewhere back there, the truth had settled into the earth. He stepped over the chain. The path was still there, barely. Nature had reclaimed most of it, but the ghost of footfalls remained, a trampled memory in the underbrush. He followed it with a flashlight, boots crunching over moss and twigs. After about 15 minutes, he saw it. The crumbling edge of the old studio's stone foundation, half swallowed by ivy and mud. The scent of rot lingered faintly, earthy and wrong. Nearby, piles of construction debris had been carelessly dumped. Wood panels, insulation, and twisted metal, remnants from the renovation, maybe even a quiet demolition. Darren walked slowly, flashlight beams sweeping. Then, something metallic caught the light. He knelt and brushed aside leaves and soil, revealing a rusted filing cabinet half buried under plywood. It took all his strength to pry the drawer open. Inside were damp, curling sheets of paper. Session logs, lyric scribbles, receipts, and, Darren's breath caught, a clear plastic folder labeled Velvet Voltage Final Takes. Inside were studio notes, track lists, and a printout of a legal document, a licensing agreement between the band and a third-party marketing firm tied to Mountain View. Jace had signed nothing, but someone had forged his name. Darren pocketed the folder. As he stood, a sudden crack of a branch behind him snapped the air. He turned sharply. 2 men in dark jackets emerged from the trees. No uniforms, no badges, just black. "You're trespassing," one of them said. Darren said nothing, backing slowly. The taller man stepped forward. "This area is restricted. You'll need to leave, now." "Under whose authority?" Darren asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mountain View owns this parcel." The second man circled to his left, flanking him. "You have 5 seconds to turn around." "Or what?" Darren demanded. "You'll make me disappear too?" The words were out before he could stop them. The men exchanged a look. That's when Darren bolted. He didn't wait to see if they chased him. He just ran, leaping over roots, slipping on wet leaves, crashing through branches. Adrenaline carried him down the slope until he saw the glint of his car through the trees. He fumbled with the keys, yanked the door open, and peeled away from the shoulder, tires kicking up gravel. He didn't stop until he reached town. In the safety of his motel room, he spread the contents of the folder across the bed. There was a receipt for equipment rental dated 2 days after the band was reported missing, a studio staff roster with 4 names he didn't recognize, and buried at the bottom, a single photograph, black and white, grainy, of 5 young people sitting in the studio's lounge, all looking directly at the camera, all wearing forced smiles. In the corner of the photo, almost unnoticeable, stood a 6th figure, half obscured by shadow, a man in a high-visibility vest, face blurred, but unmistakably familiar. Darren stared at the photo for a long time, heart pounding. He needed more. He needed official eyes on this. But the local sheriff's department had proven useless before. He needed someone who wasn't part of the machine. So, he made a decision. The next morning, Darren drove to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation regional office. It was a gray building off a quiet highway, and he arrived just as the doors opened. He asked for a meeting with anyone handling cold cases or corporate crime. The receptionist took his name. 30 minutes later, he was ushered into a small room by a woman in a gray blazer who introduced herself as Agent Naomi Chen. "I understand you have information about a missing persons case?" she asked, her tone calm but alert. Darren placed the folder on the table and began to speak. He told her everything, from the band's disappearance to the vest, the footage, the encounter with Halverson, the late-night threats in the forest. Chen listened without interrupting, taking notes quickly, her expression tightening as he went on. When he finished, she tapped the folder. "May I keep this?" "Make copies," Darren said, "but I want it back." "All right, Mr. Fields," Chen said slowly. "Let me be clear. What you're suggesting, conspiracy, fraud, possibly even murder, it's massive. And if Mountain View's involved, we're talking about a politically shielded, deeply funded corporation." "Then what do I do?" Darren asked, his voice cracking from exhaustion. Chen closed the folder. "You don't stop. You work with me now. And we dig until the mountain gives up its dead." Darren left the SBI office with Agent Chen's words echoing in his mind. "We dig until the mountain gives up its dead." For the first time in 10 years, it felt like someone besides him actually believed something terrible had happened. That his brother's disappearance wasn't just a tragic accident or a youthful rebellion gone wrong, but part of something darker, systemic, and calculated. Agent Chen had taken immediate action. Before he even stepped outside the parking lot, she had already placed 2 phone calls, one to a forensic analyst, the other to a regional task force commander. She hadn't promised miracles, but she'd promised movement, and in a case that had stagnated for a decade, that was everything. That night, back at the motel, Darren couldn't sleep. He opened his laptop and began organizing everything he had gathered. The video footage, the time-stamped emails, the photo with the vest, the studio session logs, the forged signature. He created folders, digital backups, and even printed summaries. Then he did something he hadn't done since Jace disappeared. He called the rest of the families: Olivia's brother, Ezra and Marlon's mother, Mateo's girlfriend from college, who had never really stopped waiting. At first, there was stunned silence, then voices cracking with disbelief, some trembling with restrained hope, others hardened by years of grief that had calcified into numbness. Darren didn't give false promises. He told them the truth, that something new had surfaced, that there were signs their loved ones had been silenced because of something they knew, something they resisted, and that now, maybe, just maybe, someone was finally going to listen. The following morning, he met Agent Chen again, this time in Boone, where she had arranged to speak with Rick Halverson directly. The former deputy had agreed to meet them under one condition. It wasn't to be at a police station. "He still has friends in uniform," Chen explained. "He doesn't trust we'll keep it off the record if we walk into a department." They met in a small church's empty fellowship hall, midweek and anonymous. Halverson looked older than before, his eyes sunken, his voice softer. "I didn't kill them," he said as soon as they sat. "I want that clear. But I knew something went wrong, and I didn't speak. I was a coward." "Then help us fix it," Chen replied evenly. Halverson nodded. He described the night before the band vanished, how he'd been asked by a contractor to check in on a noise complaint at the studio. When he arrived, there was no complaint. Instead, he found 2 men, one wearing tactical boots, the other with a clipboard, arguing with Jace and Olivia in the recording lounge. They wanted the band to record a jingle, Halverson said. Some corny anthem for the development plan. Jace refused, said it felt like selling out their voice. That's when the tone changed. The clipboard guy told me to go wait outside. I did. I shouldn't have. Did you see them again? Darren asked. Halverson hesitated. Only their van. It was parked near the old equipment shed. Next morning it was gone. Studio staff said they'd left early. I didn't believe it. Why didn't you report anything? Agent Chen asked. Because the company paid my overtime, he said, ashamed. And I was told, firmly, that interfering in private business disputes wasn't in my job description. Chen narrowed her eyes. Do you know who those men were? Names? Faces? I only remember the clipboard guy's name, he replied. He introduced himself as Trent Caldwell. Darren stiffened. That name had appeared on the development proposal he found in the kitchen folder. He's real, Darren confirmed. I met him once, tried to buy the studio site from me 5 years ago. Chen nodded. If that's true, and he's still active, we need eyes on him. Halverson reached into his coat and pulled out an old key. This opens the maintenance garage beneath the original studio, he said. No one ever bothered to demolish it. They built the retreat around it. If there's anything left, if the band hid something down there, it might still be waiting. Later that afternoon, Agent Chen secured a quiet warrant through state channels, citing suspicion of fraud and withheld evidence in connection to a historic missing persons case. By nightfall, she and Darren stood again at Black Rock, only this time with 2 plainclothes officers and a forensics team following close behind. They entered through a rear service door, led by Halverson's key, and descended a narrow stairwell that hadn't seen light in years. The air was thick and stale. Rats scurried. Mold crept along concrete like veins. In the center of the room, surrounded by broken furniture and dusty cables, stood a locked trunk. It was old, wooden, reinforced with steel brackets. A faded sticker on its side read, Velvet Voltage Session 3. Get it open, Chen instructed. A technician approached with tools. The latch snapped after a moment of force. Inside lay old demo reels, a journal wrapped in plastic, and, most hauntingly, a black hoodie Darren recognized immediately. It had been Jace's favorite, worn in dozens of band photos. Beneath it, bundled in canvas, were bones. Human bones. Everyone in the room went still. A voice from the back murmured, Jesus. Chen stepped forward, gloves on, and lifted a page from the journal. It read, If something happens to us, know that we said no. We said no to turning our music into a billboard. We said no to disappearing quietly. We said no to being bought. And if we vanish, it wasn't by choice. Darren's eyes blurred with tears. The words were Jace's, clear, defiant, undying. They had finally been heard. News of the discovery at Black Rock spread faster than Darren could brace for. By dawn, the perimeter around the retreat center had been cordoned off, yellow police tape fluttering in the wind like wounded flags. Local media picked up the whispers first. Skeletal remains uncovered in long-abandoned music site linked to 2009 missing persons case. But by mid-morning, national outlets were asking questions. Darren stayed quiet. Agent Chen had urged him to avoid interviews, to let the forensics team finish their work, to let the evidence speak before the cameras did. But the truth was, Darren couldn't speak even if he had wanted to. He had no words for what he had seen in that cold underground room. The hoodie, the bones, the faint scent of mildew soaked into lost dreams. It had been Jace's handwriting. There was no doubt. And somehow, seeing his brother's words, his final resistance scribbled into history like a will, hurt more than anything. The journal was a time capsule of defiance, pages filled with the last fragments of 5 voices refusing to be erased. Olivia's sketches, Ezra's drum patterns, a half-written song called Dig Deep, and always that thread of fear, of surveillance, of something closing in. Agent Chen moved swiftly. She had the site sealed, brought in the State Bureau's top forensic anthropologist, and quietly began identifying the remains. The process would take time, but the preliminary report was damning. 5 separate sets of human bones, consistent with the physical profiles of Jace Fields, Olivia Ramos, Ezra and Marlon Tate, and Mateo Lin. No one said it officially, but they all knew. Velvet Voltage had never left the mountain. That evening, Darren sat alone in his motel room, the journal on the nightstand, flipping through each page like a prayer. He stopped on a loose sheet tucked in the back. Jace's unmistakable scrawl across the top. "If we disappear, don't trust anyone who tells you it was our choice." Below it was a list of names, initials, dates. Some were studio techs, others looked like code names. One name was circled twice, T. Caldwell. Darren took a picture and sent it to Agent Chen. Her reply was immediate. "I'm heading to Caldwell's offices tomorrow morning. Don't go near him, yet." But Darren couldn't sleep, not with that name pulsing like a drumbeat in his skull. Caldwell. The man who once stood in his kitchen, sipping coffee, casually suggesting he sell the property where his brother had died. The man who'd smiled when Darren refused, then offered a better number if you change your mind. So, the man who, if Jace's journal was right, had orchestrated everything. By morning, Darren couldn't wait. He drove into Asheville and parked across the street from Summit Grove Holdings, the parent shell company for Mountain View Solutions. The building was a modern box of glass and steel, sharp lines reflecting clouds that didn't want to be seen. Darren sat in his car, watching people enter and leave, wondering which face belonged to the man who had buried 5 artists and called it progress. He didn't see Caldwell, but a familiar black truck pulled up at the front curb. Sleek, unmarked, tinted windows. The same model he'd seen at BlackRock a week ago. A man in a slate-gray suit stepped out, checked his phone, and entered through the executive lobby. Darren recognized him. From the old studio photos, the clipboard man. His stomach knotted. He pulled out his phone and called Chen. "I think I just saw one of them," he said. "He's here, in Asheville." "Don't approach," Chen warned. "We're getting warrants for digital records, financials, contracts. We need him contained, not spooked." Darren exhaled. Understood. But as he sat in his car, watching, something shifted in the pit of his stomach. He was being watched. In the side mirror, a reflection flickered. 2 men, standing beside a construction van, parked 3 vehicles down, both staring. No uniforms, no logos, just dark jackets and stillness. Darren gripped the wheel. Slowly, deliberately, he started the engine. The men didn't move. He turned onto the main road, merging into traffic, keeping his eyes in the rear view. Nothing followed. Not immediately. But the feeling wouldn't leave. He called Chen again. "They're still watching me," he said. "They know I'm part of this." Her tone shifted instantly. "Get to a public place. Don't go back to the motel. I'll arrange protection." Darren ended the call and drove straight to a local library. Bright, open, filled with students and elderly patrons reading the news. He sat near the windows, laptop open, heart pounding. It was real now. Beyond the grief. Beyond the guilt. This was danger. And it meant the people who killed Velvet Voltage weren't done trying to erase them. But Darren wasn't scared anymore. He was angry. He opened a blank document, titled it The BlackRock Files, and began writing. Not just for himself, but for every parent who'd buried silence instead of a child, for every artist who had been told to stay quiet. For Jace. They tried to bury them, he thought, but they didn't know they planted seeds. Darren didn't leave the library until just before midnight. Agent Chen had arranged a safe hotel under an alias on the other side of town, registered under the name David Grayson, 2 floors above a retired couple from Florida and across the hall from an off-duty paramedic. The kind of place no one would think to look. Still, Darren checked every mirror on the drive there, eyes darting from headlights to shadows to alleyways. The 2 men from the construction van had vanished, but the unease they brought clung to him like oil. When he finally collapsed on the bed, the cheap comforter might as well have been silk. For the first time in days, sleep found him, but it didn't last. At 3:43 a.m., a soft knock woke him. Not loud. Just 3 light taps, too polite for an accident, too deliberate for housekeeping. He didn't move, just lay there, heart hammering. Then a second knock, slightly louder. He sat up, slipped quietly from the bed, and crept toward the door. He didn't speak, just looked through the peephole. No one was there. But a folded envelope had been slid under the door. He stared at it for 10 long seconds before finally opening it. No signature, no letterhead. Just a single sentence printed in blocky, typed letters. "The ground keeps secrets. Stop digging." He stared at the words until they blurred, then grabbed his phone and snapped a photo. He sent it to Agent Chen with one word: delivered. She responded instantly, "Stay inside. Don't open the door again. I'm sending someone right now." Darren locked the door, drew every curtain, and sat in the armchair until sunrise, staring at the hallway, pulse skipping every time the ice machine clicked or someone walked past with creaky luggage wheels. When Chen arrived that morning, she brought backup. 2 agents in plain clothes who swept the hall and retrieved the envelope. "It's a warning," she said calmly, "but it also confirms something for us. Someone inside Caldwell's operation knows you're close." "Then let's get closer," Darren said, his voice rough with fatigue. "I want to know everything. What they buried, why it mattered, why 5 kids had to die to protect it." Chen nodded. "Then it's time we talk to someone who used to work under Caldwell." That afternoon, they drove to a small town 2 hours west, quiet, wooded, mostly retirees and shuttered shops. There, in a modest brick home nestled beneath a sagging willow tree, lived a man named Mark Whitaker, former junior project manager for Mountain View's Appalachian branch. He had left in 2011, 2 years after the band's disappearance, and had refused all interviews since. But Chen had leverage. Evidence from Jace's journal that linked Whitaker to forged planning permits and early documentation of the studio property. He opened the door hesitantly, a gaunt man in his 50s with nervous hands and yellowing eyes. "I don't talk to press," he said. "We're not press," Chen replied, flashing her badge, "and we have questions you'll want to answer." Inside, Whitaker poured black coffee into mugs that looked older than Darren. He didn't touch his own. "You're here about the Black Rock kids," he said quietly. "You knew what happened?" Darren asked. "Not everything, but enough." Whitaker sighed. That property was never supposed to be a studio. It was earmarked for early-stage drilling, mineral extraction, tied to private equity funding. Caldwell thought the artist residency angle would make a good front, bring in attention, investors, sentimentality. It worked, too, until the band pushed back. "They wouldn't record the anthem," Darren said. Whitaker nodded. "And worse, they talked about exposing the shell companies Caldwell was using to illegally transfer property titles from local families. One of them, your brother, I think, had a file on it. He was planning to go public." Darren's jaw clenched. "And then they vanished." "I don't know who made that call," Whitaker said, "but I remember the studio shutting down overnight. No announcement, just gone. The next week, Caldwell came in and handed me a list of things to destroy. Files, maps, internal memos, but I kept one." He stood shakily and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a manila folder with frayed corners. Inside were blueprints, real ones, and in red ink, scribbled across the lower margin of the old studio map, were the words, "Memorial wing to be constructed over vault. Reinforce foundation. Do not disturb southeast quadrant." Chen leaned over it, eyes narrowing. "This quadrant here," she said, tracing the outline, "it's not part of the main foundation. This looks like a separate underground chamber." "Caldwell called it the cold room," Whitaker said. "No one was allowed inside except contractors from a private firm. Not even me." Darren exhaled. "Then that's where we go next." Within 24 hours, Agent Chen had obtained a second warrant, this time not for evidence, but for excavation. The wording was careful, citing credible threats, corporate corruption, and potential tampering with remains linked to a cold case. By the end of the week, a forensic dig team and 2 SBI agents arrived at Black Rock with ground-penetrating radar. The retreat center had closed for renovations, the public blissfully unaware. Beneath the southeast quadrant, the radar showed an anomaly, unusual voids beneath the concrete slab, a chamber, unmapped, sealed. Darren stood behind the yellow tape as they drilled into the earth, every thud of the machine echoing like thunder in his spine. When they finally broke through into the hollow space below, silence fell. A technician climbed down slowly, flashlight slicing into the dark. A minute passed, then 2. Then the voice came, muffled but clear. "We've got something. Multiple somethings." Darren's breath caught. Agent Chen looked at him. "I think we just cracked the vault." The technician's voice echoed faintly from beneath the broken slab, growing sharper as he re-emerged from the hole, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he removed his helmet. His face, drained of color, said more than words could. "There are crates down there," he murmured. "Locked, industrial grade, stacked like storage, but they're not for equipment." Agent Chen didn't flinch. She gestured for another technician to lower a light rig and began organizing a small team to enter the hidden vault. We excavate slow, methodical. Every crate gets cataloged, logged, and photographed before so much as a screw is turned, she said, her voice tight but focused. Darren stood beside her, knuckles white against the yellow tape. He hadn't stepped inside yet, but he could feel it, like standing at the edge of a dark ocean and knowing something vast and buried waited beneath the surface. They lowered the first crate onto the floor above. It was heavier than expected, steel-framed, sealed with latches that hissed when unfastened. Inside, cushioned in black foam, were reel-to-reel tapes marked Velvet Voltage Raw Session 7. Dozens of them. Unreleased recordings. But it wasn't just the tapes that stunned them. It was the accompanying documents. Chen carefully unfolded a yellowing envelope tucked beneath the reels, labeled Property of Caldwell Holdings Internal Use Only. Inside were marketing assessments, psychological profiles, and branding documents for each band member. Olivia, visually compelling, non-compliant. Ezra and Marlon, marketable as a twin act under influence of lead singer. Mateo, emotionally vulnerable, targetable via romantic link. Jace, potential whistleblower, threat level high. Darren could barely breathe. They cataloged them, he whispered, like assets or liabilities. They weren't just silenced, Chen said darkly. They were studied, reduced to data, and then erased. The next crate revealed old recording equipment, some damaged, some functional. Beneath it, folded cloth, Olivia's jacket, Mateo's favorite hat, a necklace Darren remembered from a photo of Marlon at the lake, once bright gold, now dulled by time and dust. But the crate that shattered whatever illusion of detachment remained was the third. Inside were bones, partial, packed in tight cloth wraps like museum artifacts, carefully labeled Subject 3M. Tate, Subject 5, Unknown. God, someone whispered. Darren stepped away, nausea rising. It was one thing to find bones in a forgotten trunk, another to realize they'd been inventoried, archived. He stumbled outside, cold air hitting his lungs like knives. He sat on the gravel, head between his knees, the weight of 10 years pressing down all at once. Chen joined him a few minutes later, her boots crunching softly. I understand if you need to step back, she said. Darren looked up. No, they need someone to stand for them now. I'm not stepping away. That night, Chen's team worked in shifts, cataloging, photographing, processing every inch of the chamber. And it was a chamber, not a cellar, not an afterthought, built with intention. Reinforced walls, climate-controlled wiring, ventilation ports. It was meant to last, the lead technician reported, not just to bury, but to preserve. News of the discovery leaked despite the precautions. By morning, helicopters hovered over Black Rock, and satellite trucks lined the dirt road below. The center's official social media went dark. Caldwell Holdings issued a generic statement of cooperation with authorities. But behind the scenes, panic rippled. Darren knew the dam had cracked. He was invited to a closed-door press briefing that evening, where the Attorney General's office announced an active Moley agency investigation into Mountain View Solutions, Summit Grove Holdings, and any subsidiaries linked to the illegal acquisition, concealment, and cover-up of deaths at Black Rock. Arrest warrants were being prepared. Subpoenas were already flying. This isn't just about one band, the AG said gravely. This may involve a larger pattern of corporate silencing tied to land development and real estate fraud. Darren listened from the back, arms crossed, gaze locked on the floor. He didn't feel vindicated. Not yet. That would come later, if ever. That night, back in his motel, he finally played one of the tapes. The reel-to-reel machine whirred to life, static crackling into something raw and beautiful. Olivia's guitar, Jace's voice, clear, aching, singing a verse Darren had never heard. If they build a monument on our backs, let them know we never bowed. If they carve profit from our silence, let the truth scream louder than sound. He sat there in the dark, letting the music wash over him like ash and fire. They had tried to bury a voice. Instead, they created a requiem, and Darren would make sure the world heard every note dot. The following morning, the sun over Black Rock Mountain rose into a sky too peaceful for what was unraveling below it. News had officially broken across all major networks. Secret underground vault found beneath Music Retreat. Human remains, evidence of cover-up, linked to disappearance of rock band Velvet Voltage. The headlines were brutal, the photos raw. Crime scene tape fluttering beside candlelit vigils, tear-streaked family members holding pictures a decade old, and press fans fanned out like vultures beneath the trees. But Darren didn't watch the coverage. He was already inside a conference room at the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation headquarters, seated across from Agent Naomi Chen and two federal prosecutors from the DOJ. The walls were bare, the air clinical, but what sat on the table between them pulsed with more weight than any courtroom. The journal, the tapes, the crate's inventory, and most damningly, the confidential documents recovered from the vault, including the branding dossiers that treated his brother and his friends like algorithms instead of human beings. "We believe we have enough to issue federal indictments," said Assistant U.S. Attorney Lisa Marquette, her voice crisp but taut. "Caldwell's name appears across too many documents to claim ignorance. We've confirmed shell companies that rerouted money from BlackRock through lobbying firms in D.C., and now we're finding similar patterns in two other retreat centers his company funded, one in Tennessee, one in Oregon." Darren's heart pounded. "You're saying this might have happened elsewhere?" "Not necessarily disappearances," Chen clarified, "but the structure, the control of messaging, the erasure of resistance, it fits. We suspect Velvet Voltage may have been the first, or the only ones who refused publicly." "Which made them dangerous," Marquette added. Darren stared at the evidence. "When do you arrest him?" "Within 48 hours, Chen replied. "We're watching him now, carefully, but this needs to be airtight." Darren nodded, fists clenched. He knew patience was important. But it was getting harder to wait, knowing that the man responsible for his brother's death was probably sitting in an office, drinking imported espresso, and planning his next groundbreaking development, while the bones of 5 artists lay cataloged in body bags 100 miles away. That evening, Darren returned to BlackRock. The excavation was over. The vault had been sealed, and the site was under federal lockdown. But Agent Chen arranged for him to visit, alone, before it was transferred to long-term forensic control. He walked the length of the chamber slowly, his footsteps echoing against stone and steel, the fluorescent lamps casting ghost-like shadows against the reinforced walls. He stopped where the crate had been found, the one with Jace's hoodie and the band's final notes. There was only concrete now, but he knelt anyway, not to search, just to remember. "You fought back," he whispered. "You said no when the world tried to buy your soul, and they couldn't erase you. Not completely." He pulled a small flash drive from his coat pocket, the one that held cleaned audio from the recovered tapes, and left it gently on the ground. "This is yours," he said, "and I promise they're going to hear you." 2 days later, Darren watched from a quiet seat in a federal courtroom as Trent Caldwell was led in, wearing a designer suit and iron cuffs. He still wore the smugness of a man who had never been held accountable, but that smugness cracked when the judge listed the charges: obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and suspicion of involvement in multiple deaths under sealed federal inquiry. Darren didn't celebrate. He didn't flinch. He just watched as the man who tried to turn art into compliance was stripped at last of his illusion of untouchability. The trial would take months, possibly years, but it didn't matter. The tide had turned. The public wanted answers now. Tributes poured in across social media, covers of Velvet Voltage songs, tribute murals, podcast episodes diving into the band's story, and high school kids across the country spray painting "We Said No" on concrete walls. It wasn't just about the band anymore. It was about every voice that had ever been silenced, every creative soul erased for profit. And Darren, sitting quietly in a diner 1 week later, listened as a teenager behind the counter played a bootleg cut from Session 7 over the restaurant speakers. Olivia's guitar, raw and defiant. Jace's voice, aching and immortal. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him like morning sun. They were gone, but they were everywhere now. Unburied, undeniable, unforgotten. The resurgence of Velvet Voltage's music spread like wildfire across digital platforms. What had once been a forgotten folder of lost recordings was now the heartbeat of a growing cultural reckoning. Fans, both old and newly awakened, rallied under a single phrase lifted from Jace's journal: "We didn't vanish. We were erased." The band's unfinished songs, restored and remastered from the recovered tapes, were being shared in living rooms, coffee shops, underground shows, and even classrooms. Journalists began referring to them not just as victims of a cover-up, but as symbols of resistance against creative exploitation and corporate silencing. But for Darren, the viral wave brought little comfort. With each tribute, each article, each guitar riff echoing back from some far corner of the world, he felt the weight of truth pressing down harder. The trial was still weeks away. Caldwell's legal team was doing everything to muddy the waters, challenging the admissibility of the journal, the chain of custody on the tapes, even the validity of the forensic findings. Darren sat at a table in Agent Chen's office as she prepared a timeline for federal presentation. Maps of Black Rock, surveillance photos, scanned receipts from the vault. "I don't understand," Darren said, voice low. "Why go to these lengths? Why not just walk away from the band? Blacklist them, ruin their reputation. Why bury them?" Chen looked up, her expression unreadable. "Because your brother was never going to shut up. He wasn't just a musician. He was a liability to a network that depends on secrecy. They didn't need to ruin his career. They needed to erase his existence, and the others were collateral." That word, collateral, stabbed into Darren like cold iron. Chen leaned forward. "And there's one more thing. We didn't release this publicly yet." She opened a folder and slid a photograph across the desk. It was a close-up of another document found in the vault, a letter addressed to a man in Washington, D.C. It detailed adjustments to potential whistleblowers and included a brief mention of containing velvet voltage asset leakage through BlackRock Initiative. The recipient's name had been redacted, but the agency watermark was clear. Private Intelligence Contract Division, Diocom. Darren stared at it. "That's a government contractor." Chen nodded. "We're widening the investigation. Caldwell wasn't acting alone. This rabbit hole goes deeper than real estate." Darren didn't respond. He just pushed his chair back and walked to the window. Below, reporters loitered on the sidewalk, cameras aimed up at the building. Their lenses reflected sunlight, but in Darren's eyes, they mirrored something else, the glint of manufactured truth, now being burned away. 3 days later, Darren received an unexpected call from an anonymous number, scrambled through a VPN. He almost didn't answer, but some intuition sharpened by grief and grit, compelled him to pick up. A woman's voice, low, controlled. "Mr. Fields, you don't know me, but I knew Olivia Ramos. I was her cousin." Darren froze. "Where are you calling from?" "Somewhere far from Caldwell's reach. And I've got something you need to see." She didn't give a name, but she sent an encrypted file protected by a simple password, Sunset Session. Darren opened it alone that night. Inside was a video, grainy, time-stamped August 6th, 2009, the day before the band vanished. It showed the group in the studio lounge, laughing, teasing each other, a rare moment of calm before the storm. Then, the tone shifted. Jace stepped forward, holding a USB stick. "This has everything," he said. "The contracts they tried to slip past us, the real owner of the land, even the blueprint overlays. If anything happens to us, this has to go public." The camera shook slightly as Olivia took it from him. "If they come tonight, we lock it in the vault." The video cut out, no further footage. Darren stared at the paused screen for a long time, heart pounding. A USB drive, never mentioned, never found. He called Chen immediately. "There's another piece, a drive. Jace had it. Olivia knew where it was." Within 24 hours, a second search warrant was executed at BlackRock. This time, they brought in a specialist with a cadaver dog and a blueprint of the 2009 building layout. A forgotten maintenance crawlspace near the northwest wall, outside the vault perimeter, caught their attention. Inside, wedged behind an air duct, they found it. A sealed metal container wrapped in tape. Inside, the USB drive, untouched. It took 3 days to decrypt. When they opened it, it was all there. Scanned NDAs with forged witness signatures. Audio files of studio execs coercing band members to record a fake promotional anthem. Satellite photos of early construction zones marked as extraction points. And, most damning, email threads between Caldwell, his legal counsel, and an unnamed government liaison discussing disposal contingency. Agent Chen stared at the screen. "This is it. This blows the entire operation open." The drive was transferred directly to the DOJ's Cybercrime Division under federal seal, but Darren made one copy. Just one. And when he returned to his motel that night, he uploaded one track from the drive, their final song, We Said No, to a new website he built in silence. www.thevelvettruth.org. No press release, no hashtags, just the truth. By morning, the site had over 70,000 views. By evening, 1 million. A movement had begun, and this time, no one was going to bury it. By the third morning after the USB leak, Darren's world was no longer quiet. His phone was flooded with interview requests from national media, CNN, Rolling Stone, The Guardian. Influencers were dissecting every second of the Olivia video on YouTube. Celebrities posted solidarity tributes to Velvet Voltage, quoting Jace's final lyrics like scripture. Even more staggering, the DOJ made an unprecedented move. It released an official statement acknowledging the contents of the USB drive, calling the material deeply troubling, and confirming that additional criminal charges and federal investigations are now underway. And yet, in the midst of this eruption of public vindication, Darren found himself hollow. The world was finally seeing the truth, but it hadn't brought Jace back. Or Olivia, or Ezra, Marlon, or Mateo. The exposure felt like light pouring into a tomb, illuminating what was lost but offering no resurrection. He stood quietly outside a mural in progress in downtown Asheville. An artist was painting the 5 band members across a brick wall, Jace at the center, fist raised, Olivia mid-riff, the others around them like a constellation of resistance. Someone had already scrawled the phrase, "We were erased," in bold white letters above it. Agent Chen met him there, standing beside a utility pole where as cameras and fans gathered at a respectful distance. "Your site got over 6 million views overnight," she said. "The DOJ's phone lines are jammed. Caldwell's entire executive board is under subpoena." "Good," Darren said flatly. "There's more," she added. "We found financial records connecting Mountain View Solutions to a lobbying firm used by a defense contractor. There's enough to open charges for racketeering, conspiracy, and possibly negligent homicide under federal law." Darren stared at the mural. "But what about murder?" Chen hesitated. "That's trickier. No bodies were recovered fully intact. No cameras, no eyewitnesses. All we have are fragments, implications. We can prove a cover-up, maybe even intent to silence. But the actual act? Not yet." He clenched his jaw. "So even now, they get away with it?" "No," she said. "We're not done yet." That evening, Darren received a call from an unexpected number. It was Halverson. "I heard what you did," the former deputy said, his voice hoarse. "You burned it all down." "Not enough," Darren replied. "Not until someone admits what happened in that room." Halverson was quiet for a long time. "I wasn't there when it happened, but I was at the gates. I heard them scream once, then nothing. Caldwell told me to walk away, that if I valued my pension, I'd forget what I heard." "And you did." "I did," he admitted. "But if you need me to testify, I will. I've written a statement. Everything I know, names, places, who came and went that night." Darren didn't thank him. He just said, "Send it to Chen." The next morning, Halverson's affidavit landed on Chen's desk. The details were damning, down to the time Caldwell's men entered the studio, the name of the private security firm they contracted, and a list of license plates recorded by a gatekeeper who had since retired. Within 48 hours, 2 more arrests were made. One of them, Calvin Rhodes, head of tactical property enforcement, broke within hours of interrogation. "I never meant to kill anyone," he said on record. "We were supposed to intimidate, scare them out. But Jace resisted. He wouldn't hand over the drive. Things got out of control." "What happened to the bodies?" Chen asked. "They panicked. They buried them under the retreat. We reinforced the chamber to hide the heat signatures. Then we built the heritage wing on top to keep it sacred, off limits." "And you kept the tapes?" "They thought no one would ever come looking. Now they had it. Motive, method, confession. All that was left was the reckoning." At the press conference that followed, federal agents laid out the truth. For the first time, Velvet Voltage's disappearance was labeled not as a mystery, but as what it truly was, a corporate-facilitated act of silencing that escalated into manslaughter and multi-agency fraud. Darren watched the statement unfold live from a nearby cafe. The other families were there too. Olivia's mother clutched a faded concert photo. Ezra and Marlon's aunt wore their matching beaded bracelets. Mateo's girlfriend sobbed quietly when the charges were read. And when the camera cut to a closing clip, a short montage of the band playing under candlelight in the Black Rock studio, the tape rolling, Jace's voice trembling through static, It was no longer about guilt. It was memory reclaimed. Outside, the world didn't just mourn. It demanded change. Congress scheduled emergency hearings on corporate land seizures. Music labels started reevaluating ethics clauses. Independent artists rallied for better protections. And as for Darren, he walked alone that night to the edge of Black Rock, where the forest still pressed against the silence like a secret waiting to be unburied. He didn't bring flowers. He brought a speaker. He set it down on a stump, hit play, and let Dig Deep echo into the trees, Jace's voice rising like a flare into the night air. If the mountain won't speak, then we scream through the roots. They were gone. But now, the world was listening. Weeks passed, but the echo of Velvet Voltage only grew louder. Their story became a cultural rallying point. Beyond music, beyond justice. It had tapped into something deeper. A generational truth that art had long been shaped, silenced, or stolen by those in power. But this time, the ending was different. This time, the silence had been cracked open by a brother who refused to stop digging. Darren sat on the front steps of his childhood home in Georgia, a home where Jace once blasted demos through bedroom speakers and scrawled lyrics across the walls with a permanent marker. The house had grown quiet after the disappearance, but now it hummed again. Journalists, fans, survivors of similar artistic abuse, sending letters, videos, drawings. His inbox was a flood of gratitude and fury. A group of indie artists in Seattle had started a foundation in the band's name, the Velvet Voice Collective, offering legal aid and mental health support for musicians in exploitative contracts. Even Rolling Stone published a retrospective, the band that refused to be bought and changed the industry. But even as the world roared, Darren couldn't let go of the stillness that remained. The last trial date was approaching. Caldwell had pleaded not guilty to all charges, and though the evidence was overwhelming, the defense was betting on confusion, on the complexity of the crimes to muddy the outcome. It was all technicalities and deflections, blaming rogue contractors, loopholes, miscommunications. But Darren knew better, and so did Agent Chen. 3 days before the court date, she visited Darren at his family home, unannounced. She carried a worn cardboard box, her expression more weathered than he had seen before. "We recovered this from a second storage unit," she said, setting it down on the porch. "It belonged to a former Mountain View employee who fled the state in 2010. Found it last week. You'll want to see what's inside." Inside the box were cassette tapes, old school, hand-labeled in blue ink, field recordings, VV sessions, private room. "Where did this come from?" Darren asked, already pulling one free. "The original studio had a two-way audio system," Chen said, "meant for soundproof testing, captured everything. Someone recorded conversations between the band and the executives, and they never wiped the archive." Darren played the first tape in an old cassette deck his father had kept in the garage. The hiss of analog static gave way to voices. Jace's, steady but guarded, then Caldwell's. "You've got talent, I'll give you that," Caldwell said. "But talent doesn't pay for land permits. We need your sound to help smooth the politics." "This isn't what we signed up for," Jace replied. "We came here to make music, not sell the soul of Appalachia for a Billboard anthem." "Everything has a price," Caldwell snapped. "The sooner you understand that, the longer you last in this business." Then Olivia's voice. "If we wanted to sell out, we'd have stayed in LA. We're not afraid of walking." "Then maybe we'll help you walk, permanently," came another voice. Not Caldwell, deeper. One of the security heads, maybe. Darren stopped the tape. His hands were shaking. "They threatened them directly," he said. "We're submitting it as evidence," Chen nodded. "But I wanted you to hear it first. This isn't just about implicating Caldwell. This is about telling the story, fully." The trial began in Raleigh under maximum security and media lockdown. Darren attended every session, seated in the front row beside Olivia's mother and Ezra's aunt. The prosecution built the narrative carefully. The forged contracts, the psychological targeting, the vault, the financial trail, the death threats, the buried USB. And finally, the tapes. When the courtroom played the audio of Jace standing up to Caldwell, you could hear people in the gallery weep. Not just for what was said, but for the courage it took to say it. Caldwell never looked at Darren during the entire trial, not once. But Darren watched him, every day. Not with hatred, but with something colder. Clarity. When the verdict came, the silence was crushing. "On all counts," the judge read slowly, "we find the defendant guilty." There was no eruption of noise, just collective exhalation. Justice, delayed but not denied, had arrived. Sentencing would come later, but Darren didn't need to hear numbers. The truth was finally loud enough. That night, a tribute concert lit up Asheville's open-air arena. 5 microphones stood under a soft blue light, each one wrapped in climbing ivy and string lights. Artists from across genres came to perform Velvet Voltage's songs. Soul singers, punk drummers, folk duos, no egos, no merch tables, just memory. And at the end, as the stars stretched wide above, the lights dimmed and a video played on the massive screen. It was Jace, one of the recovered camcorder clips. He was sitting on the studio porch, guitar in lap, laughing. "I don't care if it ever makes the charts," he said, "as long as it makes someone feel something real. That's the whole point, right?" The crowd stood in silence, then applause. Raw, unfiltered, endless. Later, as the arena emptied, Darren remained in his seat. Chen sat beside him. "They'll write about this for years," she said softly. "I just wanted to find him," Darren whispered. "Now the whole world has." She looked at him. "And you gave him his voice back." He nodded, swallowing hard. Jace hadn't vanished. He had been buried. But now, he was louder than ever. 6 months later, spring settled over North Carolina like a soft apology. Trees bloomed again along the mountain roads leading to Black Rock, but the center itself remained closed, no longer a retreat, no longer a monument to false promises. The land was now under federal control, pending demolition. Yet, amidst bureaucratic delay and public demand, a new idea was growing. Quiet, persistent, not to destroy the site, but to transform it. A memorial, a creative sanctuary, a place where silence was no longer weaponized, but honored. And so, the proposal was drafted, signed, and funded by an unlikely coalition of artists, families, and former officials. The new space would be called the Velvet Preserve. Darren returned one last time before construction began. He drove alone just before dusk, the forest flickering gold between the trees. The road was quieter now, no press vans, no federal barricades, only the sound of wind and gravel and the occasional distant call of a bird. The gates creaked open with a reluctant moan. The once manicured lawns were wild again. Vines clung to the walls. The once shiny copper plaque outside the studio entrance, still bearing the name Black Rock Heritage Wing, was tarnished but untouched. He stepped through the threshold. The building was stripped bare. No tapes, no lights, no echo of laughter or music. But something deeper remained in the bones of the place, a stillness that felt sacred, not haunted. Darren walked down the corridor, past the recording booth where Jace once layered harmonies, past the lounge where Olivia cracked jokes while tuning her guitar, past the stairwell where Marlon and Ezra used to race like kids, and finally to the chamber, the vault. It was now permanently sealed, its entrance covered by a glass pane. Inside, the site had been turned into a memorial installation. 5 pillars, each etched with a name, lyrics, and a simple sentence beneath: "They never bowed." Darren stood in front of Jace's pillar. A breeze filtered through the open door behind him. He placed a folded piece of paper at the base, a copy of a letter he had never sent. It read, "You were right. They did try to silence you, but they failed. You didn't just write music, you started a movement. I wasn't strong enough to protect you then, but I hope I was strong enough to honor you now. Sleep loud, little brother." He stood there for a long time, then he turned and left, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched into something like peace. 3 weeks later, the official dedication of the Velvet Preserve drew thousands. No red carpets, no branding. Just families, fans, and musicians gathered under a sky the color of amber glass. Darren gave a brief speech, just a few words. They weren't legends, they were people. But in telling the truth, they became both. He didn't need to say more. The highlight of the event came unexpectedly. A young woman, no more than 19, stepped onto the tribute stage with an acoustic guitar. She introduced herself only as Kala. "I wasn't alive when they played," she said, voice trembling. "But my mom played their demos while pregnant with me. So, in a way, I've been listening my whole life." She played an unreleased song, something from the leaked tapes, never finished. She had filled in the missing lyrics. Her voice cracked with emotion, but her hands were steady. As she sang, people stood, not in applause, but in tribute. Later that night, Darren sat by a small bonfire with Chen, Halverson, and Olivia's mother. They shared old stories, laughed at things that hurt a little, toasted to those who'd fought and fallen, and then, as the fire dimmed, a silence settled over them, not heavy like grief, but full like memory. "Do you think they know?" Olivia's mother whispered. Darren looked to the stars. "I think they never stopped." The world had changed. Labels now included artist advocate boards. Government watchdogs had formed subcommittees for creative rights. Music schools taught the Velvet Voltage case as part of their ethics curriculum. And somewhere in that swirl of change, something shifted inside Darren too. He no longer woke up in anger. He woke up in purpose. Back in Georgia, he turned Jace's old room into a studio. Not to record music he never played, but to record stories, interviews, memories. A podcast called The Echo Archive, where families of disappeared artists could speak their truth. It wasn't about justice. It was about voice. One afternoon, months later, he received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside, a battered composition notebook. The first page was in Jace's handwriting. Track ideas, Sunset, Dig Deep, Eden's Fuse, and that one Olivia started about the fireflies. Finish it if I don't. Darren wept. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't hurt alone anymore. In the end, it wasn't the evidence that changed the world. It wasn't even the verdict. It was the choice not to look away. And that, Darren realized, was the loudest sound of all. The story of Velvet Voltage is not just about a band that vanished. It's about how art endures, how truth fights its way through silence, and how even in the darkest corners of exploitation, one voice, one song, can ignite a revolution. Though they were buried in secrecy, their legacy was unearthed by persistence, by love, and by a brother who refused to forget. Today, their music echoes not from charts or fame, but from a deeper place, etched into murals, sung in protests, whispered between strangers who believe in something more. This wasn't just the end of a mystery, it was the beginning of a movement. And Velvet Voltage will never be silent again.